This is R1 and 3 Autoethnography with your host, Stephen. In this episode, we have a special guest, Keane, who's a University of Saskatchewan student and has been diagnosed with OCD. On this podcast, we talk about our lived experiences with mental illness. So before we get started, you gotta know that we are not medical professionals, and you should see your doctor if you're concerned about your mental well-being. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Keane?
My name is Keane, and I am from a small town called Cudworth here in Saskatchewan. I grew up there for the first 18 years of my life until moving to Saskatoon for university. And then I've pretty much just been here since.
So what have you been diagnosed with again?
My official diagnoses are OCD, depression, and generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah. So I recognize that you're a member of the LGBTQ community, and would you say that kind of has intersectionality with any of these mental illnesses?
I would say there's definitely some intersectionality. Like, rates of depression and anxiety and stuff like that are way higher in people who are queer. And as a gay male, I had a lot of trouble questioning my sexuality growing up with my OCD because I would often convince myself that I was actually straight and I was confused and lying to myself. And that is a common, not necessarily common, but that is an OCD symptom where you doubt your sexuality. Like, everything I read on it online is straight people thinking that they might actually be gay because that's more typical and more common. Right. But in my case, it was the opposite. I occasionally questioned who I was, but I never really delved into it. I didn't put a label on myself until I was a lot older. I don't even think I really understood things like attraction. I used to tell people I had crushes on girls and stuff just because that was what I was supposed to do, or what I felt I was supposed to do, because everyone else around me was doing that, and people would constantly ask you, like, who do you like? And like, it's a very normal part of growing up to be expressing attraction and things like that. And for me to not have that, and then to also be questioning all of this on top of it and having to deal with my mental disorder was pretty difficult.
When did you start questioning, your identity and if there was something going on in your head?
I think for the longest time, I thought I was just suffering from general anxiety and stuff like that. And I never really had the idea that it was a more specific diagnosis, such as OCD, because I never had the tools in place to question, like, what is normal behavior and what is not. And I never had any idea how to navigate what was going on in my mind. At points, it was very stressful, especially when I would get stuck in thought loops. And I remember asking my dad if it's normal to, like, be unable to control your thoughts. And I don't even remember what his response was, but I do remember asking him that.
So how are you feeling, just before you started doing all this questioning?
I think I was stressed out, like, all the time.
Like, stressed out in what way?
Like, I was constantly worried about things. I thought my family was going to die. I thought I was going to die. I thought that if I came out as gay, that people would bully me and hate me and, like, ruin my life. And I thought I would never be accepted. It was very hard on me, I think, just because, I had to question multiple things at once. Yeah. In a small town where no one shared my identity. I didn't interact with another gay man until I was 18 years old.
Right. And what were your thoughts like at that time, if you can remember that far back?
I remember weird thoughts of, like, patterns in my head and stuff. Like, I used to draw lines between people over and over again. And I remember crying in the shower because I thought my parents died on, like, their car ride to the city with absolutely, like, no reasoning or, like, no input for why that would have happened. It was just simply they died. And this thought now exists in your head, and you're going to worry about it until you know they're safe. and until you know that they're factually safe.
Yeah, that sounds very stressful. So how did you start the whole process of getting to know yourself, I guess?
I don't think I really started until I was about 17 or 18, really. I think before then I just kind of drifted around on autopilot as best I could, getting through school and getting through high school. And, I would hear people say anti-gay things all the time. And yet I remember when I left and I came out, people were saying, oh, why didn't he just come out while he was here? And it's like, I don't even know what to say to that.
Yeah, well, that small town mentality is definitely homophobic, racist, and a lot more of that. I mean, okay, that's generalizing, but my small town was like that. Did you kind of experience the same issues?
Definitely a lot of the similar issues. And it's almost just like the idea that no one questioned how their actions or words affected anyone around them. And everyone just kind of assumed you fit the mold.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of fitting the mold, how do you think your masculinity affected your ability to get help?
I honestly think that was never a personal problem for me, because as a gay male, I've always had a skewed sense of masculinity, and I've always known that I could never traditionally be seen as masculine in like a societal lens. I always knew that there are feminine components to me that I have had for my entire life, and that, it's a balance of the two. I don't think I ever felt like less of a man for seeking help. Right. To me, that was never personally an issue.
No, that's awesome. So you could approach help from this, I guess, more of an objective lens where you recognize that you needed help, right?
Mm-hmm. And again, yeah, because I already operated out of the scope of traditional masculinity, it's not as difficult for me to take that step than it is for someone who does operate in that traditional scope.
Right. So you were 17 and then you started exploring the mental illnesses and stuff. What happened next?
I finally put a label on my sexuality at that point. I think a lot of my mental health issues came from the fact that my sister killed herself, because, it was a traumatic event, and I never properly got help, especially again in that small town situation. No one really understood what I was going through. There wasn't easy access to professionals.
Did you have someone to reside in your small town?
I had one girl who was also queer, and it wasn't the same simply because it was a girl, but it was at least somebody. And I think that did help a lot. Even if I didn't really realize it at the time, just looking back, I think it allowed me to feel safer and more sure of who I was.
So how did that change once you came to Saskatoon?
Oh, it was mind-blowing. Like, suddenly I was interacting with people who I hadn't known for my entire life, and I was interacting with people who weren't traditional, straight, conforming to heteronormative society. And of course, it's not bad to conform to heteronormative society if you want to, but being forced to is not nice.
Yeah, I definitely think it's damaging in terms of mental illness, because Levi and I both approached it with that heteronormative idea of masculinity where men don't talk about their feelings, right? So this experience in Saskatoon was helpful for you, it sounds. What was the next step? I think
the next step for me was seeking out support from professionals, especially because the Student Wellness Center was accessible at the time. I got put on medication for the first time in my life, and at first I thought it helped me, but in the end I realized it wasn't, and I needed to go a different route.
How were you feeling when you were put on that initial medication?
I felt very suicidal. I felt numb. I felt sad. I almost felt empty.
So how did you approach how did you approach professionals after that experience?
I think getting placed with a psychiatrist was probably the most helpful thing of all. because at the end of the day, a GP is not specialized to deal with the issues that are going on. The GP did help, but at the end of the day, she was only able to do so much until I needed further support from a mental health care professional who specialized in that stuff.
What did that GP think of your situation?
I think she thought it was very complicated. And I remember her telling me that at the end of the day, diagnosis is not the most important thing. And it's about symptom management and, figuring out what you can do to help yourself and what tools you can use to further your development. And I think that's an issue I had with medication at the time. I felt like it would be a fix-it. I didn't realize it was a tool that I needed to use to fix myself. And I shouldn't even use the word fix. I should say assist.
Yeah, like get you to the baseline level of a neurotypical, if you will. So you were seeking help with a general practitioner. Did you see a counselor during that time?
I did see a counselor, but at the time, because it was so focused on just general anxiety tactics and general depression tactics, I didn't see a lot of benefit from it. I think it was nice to be able to talk about my issues, but it kind of just stressed me out at the end of the day and made me think about things more.
Why did it stress you out?
I think one of the main issues is just how long it takes to get appointments. And the fact that I would see my counselor once a month, we would talk about all these stressful things, and then I'd have another month to think about all of this and deal with it until I could see him again and proceed to have that same conversation about a few new topics and have that cycle repeat.
Yeah, without really delving into the core problem or the core symptoms that you should be dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And again, just because I hadn't seen a psychiatrist at that point, there was no way to know that there were further more complicated issues than just the generalized stuff.
So once you saw the psychiatrist, what happened?
I think at that point is when I started receiving more specified help. And that is when I was able to be diagnosed with OCD. And then I was able to have therapy tactics that were aimed specifically towards that. Honestly, since the pandemic started, though, my executive functioning has dropped extremely low. And I don't think I've actually attended one of my counseling appointments in multiple months. I know I missed the last one. And it's kind of just that embarrassing feeling of like, do I even want to book another one? Like, I know that they're there to help me and it's their job to be there for me, and it's also just like, I don't want to take up that spot and then have someone else miss what they could have had because I simply forgot I had an appointment, or I was unaware I had an appointment, or I slept through my appointment, or things like that.
Yeah, I really relate to that. How did you approach this new diagnosis?
I felt like it fit for sure. I don't necessarily know that it goes all the way and encompasses everything that I have, but it's definitely a good primary start. And I think it's helped me a lot to be able to have a label and to be able to go and find other people with this label and see how their experiences line up with mine and how they have been able to navigate with this and their coping skills that they can share with me.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that too. Like with the whole ADHD community, it's made me feel a lot less different. Like I'm not crazy, right?
And I think especially with OCD, because reassuring those thoughts is a bad thing, because again, it's a cycle. You have your obsession, and then you have your anxiety from the obsession, and then you do your compulsion to get rid of the obsession and get rid of the anxiety, and then it repeats. And every time you do that compulsion to get rid of it, it cements the idea in your head that that is a valid worry and that is a valid anxiety, and that something bad will happen if you do not finish your compulsion. Whereas proper OCD treatment means having your worry, having your anxiety, and sitting with it until it goes, because you need to realize that whatever you're worried about is not actually going to happen. But completing the compulsion verifies in your mind that this is a legitimate concern and that's real and it's going to repeat, and you need to deal with it every time it comes up.
Could you give me an example in your life where reassurance kind of got you into that cycle?
I think a good generalized one is asking myself whether or not my boyfriend is actually wanting to keep a relationship with me. And so the beginning would look like questioning, if he cares or if he's going to leave for these reasons. And so then the compulsion would look like immediately messaging him and asking him, do you care about me? Do you want this relationship? And then that verifies in my mind that I need to ask that question to him in order to get rid of that. And so treatment would look like having that worry, but then I don't ask him the question. And then eventually the worry leaves and I see that he does still care about me, even though I never completed my compulsion. And allowing your brain to see that you don't need to complete your compulsions in order for your anxieties to leave is like the only way to manage OCD properly. Because again, you fall into the cycle if you complete your compulsion.
So how do you feel? How do you feel when you're like in that state where you have that obsession?
It's nearly the only thing I can think about. And you pretty much just have to sit there and let the worry run its course.
And there's like no duration for it usually?
It's usually not that long in my case. I'm pretty lucky. Mine will only last like 5-10 minutes. I know some people have like 20 plus minutes where it just won't go away. And again, if you're used to completing your compulsion, you're going to be more worried than if it's a new obsession where you have no pre-existing stimuli to reinforce that.
What does that obsession sound like in your head?
It's almost like a verbal assault from my brain, almost like forcing words into itself to ask me something that I never felt the need to ask in the first place.
So kind of like a feeling of overwhelming anxiety where your mind is just going in circles, kind of?
Kind of, yeah. And just like a repeated thought of this is going to happen, or this is going to happen, or this is going to happen, unless you complete your compulsion, which will reinforce that it's going to happen.
So how do you cope with that when you're feeling that way? Is there no other way than just to sit with it?
There are definitely things you can do to help, like you can exercise or use regular anxiety coping mechanisms. But I guess at the end of the day, the obsession's not just going to go away, because it's like an old needle stuck on a record. It doesn't move until it's ready to move, or you complete your compulsion. And again, it becomes a worsening cycle over time as you get more used to it. And it eventually gets to the point that even your compulsions will cause you anxiety because they're so time consuming, or they're just so rigid in structure.
So you can do things, but it won't shut your mind down, right?
Pretty much.
Reflecting back on your time in Cudsworth, is that right? Okay. Reflecting back on your time in Cudworth, could you kind of see some of that when you were growing up?
Oh, definitely. I think I avoided a lot of situations because I knew they would stress me out, and because avoiding the situation would cause me to not get the anxiety in the first place. And so that just became an avoidance technique where, again, my anxieties got worse over time because I kept avoiding the situation. So then the idea of actually going into that situation was just completely terrifying.
And what were those things for you?
I think driving is a good example. Anytime I was behind the wheel, I felt like I was going to hit someone, kill someone, crash the car, kill myself, damage something, get into trouble with the law by accident, things like that. And so I wouldn't drive. And then I'd get more anxious about driving. So I would proceed to not drive again. And then I would get more anxious about driving. And I would proceed to never drive again. Because at the end of the day, the idea of having to do it was just so much anxiety, especially involving the fact that like these terrible things would happen if I were to drive, even though I have no evidence or no reason to believe that, as I've never been in a car accident or anything. But just something so simple escalated so heavily because I avoided the situation.
So if you were to stop driving, is that kind of like reassurance that you would hurt someone if you drove?
Kind of, almost like, because I had no way to know I wouldn't hurt someone if I was driving, because I had no driving experience, because I wasn't going and practicing driving. I couldn't see for myself that I drove fine, and I couldn't see that I'm not hurting people and killing people. And because I never did that, the thought just stayed there forever. And it got to the point where the idea of driving was like crippling.
So yeah, it definitely sounds like you have recognized this. In terms of accepting your diagnosis, were you kind of okay with it?
I'm okay with having the diagnosis, but I often feel like I lied to my psychiatrist and I don't actually have this, and I'm lying to myself and I don't actually have this. And again, it's just questioning my identity constantly. Almost like I can never be 100% sure of something, because there are those little elements of unsurety that I need to consider, which I don't actually need to consider, but my brain feels the need to consider them. And again, that just goes back to, it asks you questions that you don't need to answer.
Is the uncertainty a big part of what you struggle with?
Oh yeah, I would say uncertainty is almost the entire struggle. It's just the thought that anything could go wrong at any time in any place, even if I have no objective reason to believe that. And there's no evidence that anything is going to get destroyed or hurt. I will still believe that it's possible and likely.
Yeah, it definitely sounds really challenging. Have you been able to kind of find a community of people who can relate to you?
I think online is definitely where I've been able to find this the best. I honestly haven't personally looked into many local communities involved in that, but even simple things like Reddit can be extremely helpful sometimes, just to go on there and see other people with this who can tell you exactly what they've gone through with the anonymity of the internet, and there's no embarrassment there or anything. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with OCD is you just feel very ashamed to share a lot of it, because some of the thoughts are so disturbing and they're things that you would never dream of doing, and yet you question if you're capable of that, and you feel like you might do that when you have no reason to actually believe that.
So could you go to your friends for reassurance for that? Or would that be...
I could, and then it would become a cycle of me seeking reassurance from them every time I had that worry. And that would be the only way to fix it. And that becomes the compulsion. like reassurance seeking is definitely my area of compulsion.
So, yeah. What was I going to say? Yeah, like, I'm not in your situation, but from what I've heard, I think, like, if you were to bring up thoughts like that, where, say, we go back to the driving example, if you say, I think I might kill someone when I'm driving, someone could tell you, no, you're not going to do that, et cetera, and that would kind of build on that, right?
It would build on the fact that the thought is legitimate in the first place when it isn't.
Even if people are telling you that the thought isn't legitimate?
They can do that, but they need to not reassure you. They can't tell you that you're not going to kill anyone. They just need to tell you that thought is not real. It has no evidence. You need to let it go. You need to wait it out. Because again, them reassuring it in the first place confirms to your brain that it was okay to worry about. And now you're going to worry about it again because you can just seek reassurance again.
So was that kind of a recurring pattern with some of your friendships?
I think more so my family relationships is where I reflected that. Like, I remember I would constantly ask people if I was a decent person, or I was worried I was a really bad person growing up. I used to think I was evil, and I used to think I would, like, grow up and be a murderer, and, like, just, you know, completely irrational things. Or, like, I would worry as I'm petting a cat, I'm going to suddenly crush its skull. And, like, of course, everyone has intrusive thoughts, but these are to the point where they're debilitating and repetitive and turns into a cycle.
So before you understood it, you would go to your family to cope with it?
I would either internalize it and attempt to deal with it on my own, which just resulted in more anxiety, or I would seek reassurance, yeah.
That sounds like a bad cycle. So how have you been able to work with it now?
I think I'm really lucky in the fact that as I've gotten older, it has gotten less severe. And also just the realization that these are not normal anxiety things. These are illegitimate thoughts that my brain is placing there without me wanting to have that or wanting to question that or feeling even the need to question that.
Yeah. So how did you get to that point?
I think getting diagnosed was probably the most helpful part. And then especially those initial counseling appointments that I actually attended, where I was given, like, you know, resources that I could look up on why this happens and how this happens and what different types it looks like.
Yeah. So you talked about being a decent person, and that was an intrusive thought. So what do you think the intersectionality between self-esteem and your mental illness is or was?
Oh, I definitely think there's a huge amount of intersectionality there. It's hard to have self-esteem when you feel like you're disgusting and evil and cannot properly function in society, even if all of these things are false. It can be very debilitating to have to question who you are as a person when you don't even feel the need to.
Is it hard to separate what you think of yourself from OCD, your intrusive thoughts?
Oh, I would say it's very difficult, especially as a very self-critical person, and especially with other comorbidities that intersect there and cause me to have self-doubts that are not necessarily intrusive thoughts. It can be hard to separate what is intrusive and what is actually me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, yeah, that does make sense. Do you kind of have an idea of who you are now?
I'm still working on it, I'd say. I definitely still am. I think I have a lot clearer of a picture than I did growing up, but it's an everyday process. It's not something that just falls into place.
Yeah. So how did you cope with it? Understanding that, or how did you cope with thinking that you're a shitty person? when it was your OCD?
I think it was just kind of the realization that my thoughts have no bearing on the real world. And they're simply thoughts. And like, as much as I can think about killing people and murdering people, at the end of the day, I've not ever killed a person. And so I know objectively as a fact, I am not currently a murderer. And so when I ask myself, am I capable of these things? And am I going to do these things? All I can do is look at what is factual. I've never done that. I don't feel like doing that. I don't feel like that is who I am. And so it's almost like you have to reconcile that with these intrusive thoughts that are trying to tell you what terrible things you might do. And the thing is, might. It's, at the end of the day, anyone is capable of being a terrible person. But simply having thoughts in your head does not make you a terrible person.
Yeah. How do you feel when those thoughts come up?
At this point, a lot of them are honestly just kind of funny. Because like it gets to the point where it's just like, why am I thinking this? Or like, this is so obscene that it's like, how could I even possibly think I'm capable of this, or that this will happen in a day-to-day life? And because it tends to be so irrational, I think I basically have to separate, what my brain is telling me I am versus who I actually am based on my lived experiences and my interactions in the actual world, not just the interactions my brain is telling me will happen or might happen. Because, again, a thought crime is just a thought crime. There is no actual basis of anything there. People have intrusive thoughts all the time. Most people, they just go away and it's fine. But learning to recognize that these things are so irrational and that they're so out of the realm of ordinary thinking and operation that they don't reflect who I am in any way.
Yeah. So did you ever feel like your sexuality was irrational?
Oh, I think I thought that a lot growing up. Again, I didn't put a label on it until I was about 17 or 18 because I had so much doubt about whether I was telling myself the truth or not. And because I had no outside support when it came to that, it was an entirely internal process that I had to deal with on my own. And I think I would have been able to come to terms with it a lot sooner if there weren't those things in the background.
So if you could go back with everything that you know now, what would you tell yourself?
I think I would tell myself that you don't need an answer to every question, and that sometimes it's just best to leave things as they are, and you're not a terrible person simply because you had a thought that you don't agree with. And I think that's the most important part. If you were a terrible person and you were having these thoughts, you would not ask yourself if you're a terrible person. You would not be trying to come up with arguments against these thoughts. You would not be trying to counter these thoughts. A terrible person would simply think these things on their own without questioning it and without caring. Simply the fact that you are worried about being a terrible person is kind of proof enough that you have a conscience and you are at least capable of having morality and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good answer. Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for coming on to the show today and sharing your experience. So hopefully you guys liked this episode. Make sure to check out our website in the description and subscribe on whatever platform you're on. You'll also find some resources and references we used for this episode in the description. And once again, we are not medical professionals and you should see your doctor if you're concerned about your mental well-being. We'll see you next time.